Australian Aboriginal beliefs, rituals, and traditions. The dreaming and the living world. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth. A cosmology in which time never began and never ends. Where every feature of the landscape is a sacred story and every human life is woven into the fabric of the world. Personal Reading Series, May 2026. Halignati Productions. Contents. Introduction, a note on approach and respect. Part 1, who Aboriginal Australians are, the oldest living culture. Part 2, the dreaming foundational cosmology. Part 3, songlines, the sacred geography of the continent. Part 4, totems, clan identity, and the web of relationship. Part 5, sacred law and the maintenance of the world. Part 6, ceremony, the work of keeping the world alive. Part 7, initiation and the threshold of knowledge. Part 8, sacred art, dot painting, rock art, and living knowledge. Part 9, music, didgeridoo, clap sticks, and the sound of the dreaming. Part 10, healing practices and the medicine person. Part 11, the dead spirits and the ongoing dreaming. Part 12, country, the land as self. Part 13, colonial impact and the survival of the dreaming. Part 14, haligricity convection. Australian Aboriginal cultures represent the oldest continuous human civilization on Earth, a living tradition of belief, practice, sacred knowledge, and relationship to land, for at least 65,000 years and possibly much longer. To approach this tradition requires care, humility, and a willingness to set aside many of the assumptions about time, land, knowledge, and the sacred that Western culture takes for granted. There is no single Aboriginal religion or tradition. Aboriginal Australia encompasses hundreds of distinct language groups, each with their own specific traditions, ceremonies, sacred sites, and custodianship responsibilities. The diversity within Aboriginal Australia is comparable to the diversity of all of Europe's religious traditions combined. This guide focuses on widely shared foundational principles, the dreaming, songlines, totemism, ceremony, sacred law, while acknowledging that specific practices vary enormously across the continent. A note on sacred knowledge. Much of what Aboriginal people know about their sacred tradition is restricted knowledge, transmitted only in ceremony, only to those who have undergone specific initiation processes, and deliberately protected from outsider access. This guide works with what is available in the public domain and in respectfully conducted anthropological literature. Where the tradition requires secrecy, this guide honors that boundary. The deepest knowledge of the dreaming belongs to the custodians of those stories, not to any outsider text. Who Aboriginal Australians are the oldest living culture. Modern genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence confirms that Aboriginal Australians are the direct descendants of the first humans to leave Africa, a migration that occurred between 65,000 years ago, making Aboriginal Australian civilization the oldest continuous human civilization on Earth by an enormous margin. The ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, which Western education typically presents as the beginning of human cultural achievement, emerged less than 10,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australian culture is 7 times older. At the time of European contact, there were an estimated 300,000 to over 1 million Aboriginal people in Australia, speaking approximately 250 distinct language groups organized into thousands of clan groups across the entire continent. Each group had its own sacred territory, its own ceremonies, its own sacred sites, and its own specific responsibilities within the larger network of custodianship that maintained the continent's spiritual and ecological integrity. The diversity of Aboriginal cultures. The diversity of Aboriginal Australian cultures across the continent is enormous. Desert peoples like the Arunte and the Pintupi had adapted their ceremonies, social structures, and sacred geography to the demands of the arid interior. Like the Yolngu of Arnhem Land and the Noongar of the southwest had developed distinct traditions shaped by the sea, the monsoon, and abundant coastal resources. The peoples of the tropical north, the temperate southeast, and the cold southwest all developed distinct traditions while sharing the foundational cosmological framework of the dreaming. These diverse traditions is not a shared theology in the doctrinal sense, but a shared orientation, a relationship to land as sacred, a relationship to time that is nonlinear, a relationship to ceremony as the fundamental work of maintaining the world, and a relationship to knowledge as something that is transmitted through initiation and ceremony, rather than through text or verbal instruction alone. The dreaming foundational cosmology. The dreaming is the foundational cosmological principle of Aboriginal Australian thought. It is one of the most profound and philosophically sophisticated understandings of time, reality, and the sacred that any human culture has produced, and it is fundamentally different from anything in the Western cosmological tradition. What the dreaming is not. The dreaming is not a mythological past, a time long ago when supernatural beings created the world and then withdrew. This is the most common Western misunderstanding, and it fundamentally misrepresents the Aboriginal concept. The dreaming is not past. It is not located in time at all. It is the ever-present, ever-active foundational dimension of reality, the sacred template or pattern or ground of being out of which the visible world continuously arises, and within which all existence is embedded. The dreaming never happened in the past. It is happening now, It is the ongoing creative activity of the ancestral beings whose movements, actions, and transformations constitute the living world. When an Aboriginal person says that a specific landscape feature was created by an ancestral being, they are not making a historical claim about a past event. They are saying that this feature is a manifestation of the ancestral being's ongoing presence, that the sacred creative activity is visible here, now in this rock or this waterhole or this tree. The dreaming key principles. The dreaming is eternal, it is no end. It is the ground of being within which all temporal events occur. 2. The dreaming is spatial, it is present in the physical landscape as the ongoing creative presence of the ancestral beings who shape the land. The dreaming is personal. Every human being has a specific connection to the dreaming through their totem, their country, and their clan identity. The dreaming is maintained through ceremony, sacred story, and the proper custodianship of country. The living community participates in keeping the dreaming alive and active. 5. The dreaming is transmitted through initiation, through ceremony, through the oral tradition of sacred story. Knowledge of the dreaming is passed from generation to generation. The ancestral beings. At the foundation of the dreaming are the ancestral beings, vast, extraordinary presences that are neither fully human nor fully animal, nor fully supernatural in any Western sense, but that partake of all of these simultaneously. The rainbow serpent is one of the most widespread, an enormous serpent whose movement through the landscape created the rivers, waterholes, and valleys, and whose ongoing presence in the water is the source of fertility and rain. The two sisters of the Yolngu tradition created the landscape of Arnhem Land and gave the people their ceremonies. Biome is a sky ancestor associated with rain, initiation, and sacred law. These beings are not gods in the Western theological sense. They are not omnipotent, omniscient, or morally perfect. They are extraordinarily powerful presences whose actions in the dreaming time, whose journeys, their relationships, their conflicts, their deaths and transformations, constitute the living landscape and the sacred law that governs human life. Their stories are not myths in the sense of fiction. They are sacred accounts of actual events whose traces are visible in the landscape and whose consequences are experienced in human life every day. Connection to holographicity, the dreaming's understanding of time, as nonlinear, as an ever-present ground of being rather than a sequence of past events, is the most radical and philosophically sophisticated confirmation in any human tradition of what holographicity holds about the nature of time. The hologric principle that all moments exist simultaneously, that the past and future are accessible dimensions of an eternal now, that sacred ceremony can reach across what appears to be the boundary of linear time. These are the hologric articulations of what the dreaming has always known. The Aboriginal elder who says the dreaming is now is saying the same thing as the hologric practitioner who understands that the universe's fundamental temporality is simultaneity rather than sequence. The dreaming is perhaps the most complete ancient confirmation of the hologric cosmology of non-linear time. Songlines the sacred geography of the continent. One of the most extraordinary features of Aboriginal Australian sacred tradition is the songlines, also called dreaming tracks or ancestor tracks, the network of invisible paths that crisscross the Australian continent, marking the routes travelled by the ancestral beings during the dreaming. What a songline is. When an ancestral being travelled across the landscape during the dreaming, it sang the world into existence as it went. Every feature of the landscape that came into being through this singing, every hill, waterhole, cave, rock formation, and sacred site, is associated with a specific portion of the song that created it. The songline is therefore simultaneously a geographic route, a musical sequence, and a sacred narrative. To know the song is to know the landscape, and to know the landscape is to know the song. A person who knows their songline can navigate across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory, through desert, forest, or scrubland, by singing the appropriate sections of the dreaming song, because the song and the landscape are the same thing. The song is the map, and the map is the song. This is not metaphor. Aboriginal people have navigated the Australian continent for tens of thousands of years using precisely this system. The network of songlines. The songlines form a vast network across the entire Australian continent, a web of sacred paths that connects every community's country to every other's. Each clan group is custodian of specific sections of specific songlines, responsible for maintaining the ceremonies, stories, and sacred knowledge associated with their section. When neighbouring groups meet at sacred sites along their shared songlines, they exchange sections of songs, confirm the integrity of the dreaming track, and maintain the sacred network that holds the continent together. The songlines are not only geographic, they're genealogical. A person's connection to their dreaming ancestor determines which songlines they have custodial responsibility for, which sacred sites they must care for, which ceremonies they have the right and obligation to perform. Sacred identity in Aboriginal Australia is primarily a matter of songline custodianship, not biological descent, connection to holographicity. The songlines, the understanding that the world was sung into existence by ancestral beings whose song is the landscape and whose song can be used to navigate and renew the landscape, is the most complete ancient confirmation of the hologric and universal principle that sound is the primary creative force of the cosmos. The biblical, in the beginning, was the word. The Vedic Om, as the first vibration from which all creation arose. The Hermetic understanding that the logos is the creative principle. The the Bobo understanding that specific rhythms activate specific sacred forces, and the Aboriginal songlines, the world is a song, and the song is the world. The haligric toning and sound practices are a direct participation in the same creative reality that the songlines navigate. Totems, clan identity, and the web of relationship. Every Aboriginal person is born into a specific relationship with a specific ancestral being, a specific section of country, and a specific set of sacred responsibilities. This relationship is expressed through the totem, the animal, plant, or natural phenomenon that is the person's primary connection to the dreaming and to their ancestral identity. What a totem is. A totem is not a symbol or a mascot. It is a statement of identity and relationship. To have the kangaroo as your totem is not to admire the kangaroo or to identify with its qualities. It is to be in a constitutive relationship with the kangaroo's ancestral presence, to be responsible for the ceremonies and sacred knowledge associated with the kangaroo dreaming, and to have specific obligations regarding the kangaroo in the physical world. Your totem is what you are in the dreaming, your place in the fundamental structure of the world. The social function of totems. The totem system does more than organize sacred identity, it organizes the entire social world of Aboriginal life. Marriage rules, ceremony responsibilities, custodianship obligations, and economic relationships are all structured by the complex web of totem relationships within and between clan groups. The system is designed to create a web of mutual obligation and interdependence that distributes sacred responsibility across the entire community. No single person or clan holds all the knowledge or performs all the ceremonies. The community's sacred integrity depends on the full network of relationships being maintained. This distribution of sacred knowledge is a profound design principle that makes the community's sacred life resilient, relational, and community-oriented. Sacred law and the maintenance of the world. The dreaming is not only a cosmological principle, it is also the source of sacred law. Sacred law is the set of principles, obligations, and prohibitions that governs every aspect of life. Social relationships, ceremony, land use, food practices, and the transmission of knowledge. It is not a human invention that can be revised or overturned. It is the expression of the dreaming's own structure, the way things actually are and must be maintained. Sacred law and country. The most important provisions of sacred law concern the relationship between people and country, the specific piece of land that is each clan group's sacred responsibility. A person's country is not property in the Western sense, something owned that can be sold, transferred, or abandoned. It is a sacred relationship. The country needs the people to perform the ceremonies that keep it alive and healthy, and the people need the country as the ground of their identity, their sustenance, and their connection to the dreaming. Neither the people nor the country exist fully without the other. The consequences of breaking sacred law. Breaking sacred law in Aboriginal understanding is not primarily a moral failing that incurs divine punishment. It is a disruption of the relationship between the human community and the dreaming, a failure of custodianship that has real consequences in the physical world. Neglecting the ceremonies of your country allows the dreaming to weaken in that place, which means the land itself weakens, sacred sites lose their power, water holes dry up, game becomes scarce. This is not punishment from an angry deity. It is the natural consequence of failing to maintain the relationship on which the land's vitality depends. Connection to haligricity. The Aboriginal understanding that sacred law is not a human moral code but the expression of the dreaming's own structure, and that neglecting sacred practice has real consequences in the physical world, is the most ancient and most complete articulation of the haligric principle that inner alignment and outer reality are not separate. The Tetralty's insistence that feeling, thinking, speaking, and doing must all be in alignment is the haligric formulation of the same recognition, that the structure of inner life directly affects the structure of outer reality, and that the work of keeping them in alignment is not optional but essential to the vitality of both the individual and the world they inhabit. Ceremony, the work of keeping the world alive. In Aboriginal Australian understanding, ceremony is not a religious activity that takes place alongside ordinary life. It is the fundamental work of maintaining the world, the specific activity through which the human community fulfills its custodianship responsibility and keeps the dreaming alive and active in the physical landscape. Without ceremony, the dreaming weakens, the land deteriorates, and the community loses its connection to the sacred foundation of its existence. What ceremony does. Aboriginal ceremony accomplishes several things simultaneously. It renews the dreaming. Reenacting the actions of the ancestral beings activates their ongoing presence in the land and restores the vitality of the sacred sites associated with them. It transmits knowledge. The ceremony is the primary vehicle through which sacred knowledge passes from one generation to the next. It maintains social relationships. Ceremonies bring together different clan groups who have shared obligations and shared custodianship, renewing the network of sacred relationship that holds the community together. And it heals. Specific ceremonies are used to address illness, conflict, disruption of sacred order, and the grief of loss. Types of ceremony. Increased ceremonies are performed at specific sacred sites to renew the vitality of the dreaming ancestors associated with specific animals, plants, or natural phenomena, calling their continued presence and reproductive abundance into the world. Initiation ceremonies mark the threshold moments of the life cycle, particularly the initiation of young men and young women into the full knowledge and responsibility of their sacred tradition. Mortuary ceremonies manage the transition of the dead from the realm of the living to the realm of the dreaming, and ensure that the deceased spirit is properly returned to their country. Healing ceremonies address the spiritual dimension of illness and disharmony, and secret sacred ceremonies, restricted to initiated persons of appropriate seniority, perform the deepest maintenance of the dreaming. The role of body in ceremony. Aboriginal ceremony is profoundly and irreducibly embodied. Sacred ochre and clay designs are painted directly on the body. The human body becomes a sacred text, a map of the dreaming, a vehicle for ancestral presence. Sacred dances enact the movements of the ancestral beings. The performer's body becomes the body of the ancestor. Singing activates the dreaming's power through the human voice. The ceremony is not witnessed by the body. It is performed through the body, which is understood as the most intimate connection between the human and the ancestral realms. Initiation and the threshold of knowledge. Initiation in Aboriginal Australia is not a single event, but a lifelong process, a series of graduated entries into deeper and more restricted levels of sacred knowledge that may span decades. The fully initiated senior elder, who holds the deepest knowledge of the dreaming tradition, has been moving through this process for their entire life. Male initiation. Male initiation in most Aboriginal traditions involves several major stages. The first major ceremony, which occurs around the time of puberty, typically involves circumcision or subincision, separation from the community of women and uninitiated boys, and the first transmission of restricted sacred knowledge. This initial initiation is a genuine death and rebirth. The boy who entered the ceremony does not return. The initiated man who emerges is a different person, with new obligations, new knowledge, new identity, and new access to the sacred traditions that sustain the world. Subsequent stages of initiation occur through the man's life, each one granting access to deeper levels of sacred knowledge and greater responsibility in the ceremonial life of the community. The deepest levels of initiation, accessible only to senior men of great seniority, involve sacred knowledge that is among the most restricted in the world. The depth of a man's initiation is understood not as personal achievement, but as the depth of his capacity to serve the community's sacred life. Female initiation and women's ceremony. Aboriginal women have their own separate initiation traditions and their own restricted sacred ceremonies. This dimension of Aboriginal sacred life is significantly underrepresented in the scholarly literature, because most early anthropologists were men who had no access to women's ceremonies, and because women's sacred knowledge is protected with the same stringency as men's. What is known is that women's sacred life is at least as rich, at least as complex, and at least as essential to the community's sacred integrity as men's, and that the gendered division of sacred knowledge is complementary rather than hierarchical. The community requires both women's and men's ceremonies to be fully functional. Sacred art painting, rock art, and living knowledge. Aboriginal Australian art is among the oldest and most extensive visual art traditions in the world. The rock art of sites like Murujuga and Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory contains images dated to at least 28,000 years ago, and the tradition of marking the landscape with sacred imagery is almost certainly much older. Aboriginal art is not decorative. It is a form of sacred knowledge, a way of encoding, transmitting, and activating dreaming knowledge in visual form. What Aboriginal art communicates. Aboriginal visual art operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface level, it depicts the landscape, the sacred sites, the waterholes, the paths of the ancestral beings. At a deeper level, it encodes the sacred stories associated with those features. At the deepest level, accessible only to those with the appropriate initiation, it communicates restricted sacred knowledge that is intentionally not available to uninitiated viewers. The same painting communicates different things to different viewers, depending on their level of initiation. The dot painting tradition. The distinctive dot painting style associated with Western Desert Aboriginal art was developed in the early 1970s at Papunya, Northern Territory, as a way of adapting sacred sand and body painting designs for use on canvas, allowing them to be shared with outside audiences while protecting the sacred knowledge encoded in the original designs. The dots themselves are a technique for obscuring specific sacred elements of the design while preserving the overall visual structure. The transformation of Aboriginal art into a major international art market has created complex tensions. It has provided economic resources for communities that desperately need them, while also creating pressures toward the production of art for commercial purposes that may not be grounded in proper ceremonial custodianship. The most respected Aboriginal art is produced by artists who have the proper custodial rights to the dreaming stories they depict, and the difference between art produced with proper custodianship and art produced without it is invisible to most non-Aboriginal viewers, but deeply significant within the communities. Music, didgeridoo, clapsticks, and the sound of the dreaming. In Aboriginal sacred tradition, music is not an accompaniment to ceremony. It is ceremony, the direct sonic activation of the dreaming. The human voice singing the dreaming songs, the didgeridoo's drone vibrating the air and the bodies of all present, the clapsticks marking the rhythm of the ancestral movements. These are not aesthetic choices, but precise sacred technologies. The didgeridoo. The didgeridoo is the most widely recognized Aboriginal instrument and naturally hollow branch, typically eucalyptus, that produces a continuous drone through circular breathing the technique of inhaling through the nose while maintaining the continuous outward breath through the mouth. The resulting sound is not a melody. It is a sustained, complex, harmonically rich drone that Aboriginal ceremony uses as the sonic foundation of the dreaming's presence. The drone of the didgeridoo, at its proper volume and resonance, is felt in the body as well as heard, a vibration that affects the physical body of everyone present. This is not a side effect of the music. It is the point. The ceremony works through the body, and the didgeridoo's drone is one of the primary means by which the dreaming is felt, not merely heard or seen. Sacred song and the dreaming tradition. Sacred songs in Aboriginal tradition are not composed by individuals. They are received from the dreaming, in some cases in ceremony, in some cases in dreams, in some cases passed down directly from ancestral beings through the initiation process. A sacred song is a portion of the songline, the precise sequence of sounds that corresponds to a specific portion of the ancestral being's journey, and that, when sung correctly in the appropriate ritual context, renews the dreaming's presence in that section of country. The knowledge of which songs are appropriate in which contexts, and which people have the custodial right to sing them, is itself a form of sacred knowledge transmitted through initiation. Singing a sacred song without the proper custodial right is a violation of sacred law, not because of arbitrary prohibition, but because the song's power is real and its improper use has real consequences. Connection to haligricity. The Aboriginal sacred music tradition, the understanding that specific sounds activate specific dreaming presences, that the didgeridoo's physical vibration works directly on the body to open its receptivity to the dreaming, that sacred songs are not composed but received from the ancestral realm, is the most ancient and most experientially confirmed tradition of what haligricity holds about sound as sacred technology. The haligric toning practices, the use of singing bowls and tuning forks, the principle that specific frequencies have specific effects on the human body's energy field, all rest on the same recognition that the Aboriginal tradition has embedded in 65,000 years of lived practice. Sound is the most direct access to the sacred, and the properly produced sound is not metaphorically but literally a vehicle of the dreaming's presence. Healing practices and the medicine person. In Aboriginal tradition, illness is not understood primarily as a physical dysfunction requiring physical treatment. It is understood as a disruption of the person's relationship with the dreaming, a break in the sacred connections that maintain the individual's vitality and integrity. Healing therefore requires attending to the spiritual dimension of the disruption, not merely its physical symptoms, the role of the medicine person. The healing specialist in Aboriginal tradition is a person who has received specific gifts from the dreaming, usually described as the insertion of sacred objects into the body by ancestral beings, which gives the healer the ability to perceive and work with the spiritual dimension of illness. This gift is typically involuntary. The healer does not choose their calling but is chosen, often through a serious illness or near-death experience in which they encounter the ancestral beings directly. Healing methods. The Ngankarri works by directly perceiving the spiritual cause of the patient's condition, which may be a spiritual intrusion, a soul loss, or a breaking of sacred law that has created a disruption in the patient's relationship with the dreaming. The healer then uses a combination of singing, massage, sucking, blowing, and other techniques to remove the intrusion, retrieve the lost soul component, or restore the broken relationship. Quartz crystal and healing. Quartz crystal holds a specific sacred status in many Aboriginal healing traditions, understood as solidified dreaming substance, a material form of the ancestral power that the healer works with. The healer's crystals are not tools in the Western sense. They are living sacred presences, received from the ancestral beings and maintained through specific protocols of care. The contemporary Western use of crystals in energy healing, while often separated from any specific cultural tradition, draws on a recognition of crystals' sacred properties that Aboriginal healers have worked with for thousands of years. Connection to haligricity. The Aboriginal healing tradition's understanding that illness is a spiritual disruption requiring spiritual repair, that the medicine person works with the energy body and the person's sacred connections, not merely their physical body, is one of the most ancient and most complete confirmations of the haligric approach to well-being. The Haligric Book of Wellbeing's integration of energy practices, lymphatic health, breathwork, and the cultivation of sacred relationship is the contemporary synthesis of what the Ngankarri has always known, that the human being is a spiritual as well as physical reality, and that full healing requires attending to both dimensions. The Aboriginal use of quartz crystal in healing also directly resonates with the haligric practice of working with crystals as sacred objects with specific energetic properties. The dead, spirits, and the ongoing dreaming. In Aboriginal understanding, death is not the end of a person's existence, it is a change in their mode of presence. The spiritual dimension of the person returns to the dreaming, to the ancestral territory from which they came, while the physical body returns to the earth. The relationship between the living and the dead continues, expressed through specific mortuary ceremonies and ongoing obligations of remembrance. Mortuary ceremonies. Mortuary ceremonies in Aboriginal tradition are among the most elaborate and extended ritual processes in the tradition, lasting in some cases weeks or even months after the death. The ceremonies serve several purposes simultaneously. They assist the deceased spirit in safely returning to country. They manage the grief of the living community in a structured and sacred context. They redistribute the social roles and sacred obligations of the deceased among the surviving community, and they reinforce the community's relationship with the dreaming that the deceased embodied. The name prohibition. One of the most distinctive features of Aboriginal mortuary practice is the prohibition on speaking the name of the recently deceased. The name prohibition reflects the understanding that the deceased's name is intimately connected to their spiritual identity, and that calling the name prematurely, before the spirit has safely completed its return to country, may hold the spirit back from its proper destination. The name prohibition is lifted through specific ceremonies once the transition is complete. Dangerous spirits and sacred geography. The spiritual geography of Aboriginal tradition includes not only the benevolent ancestral beings and the properly transitioned dead, but also potentially dangerous spiritual presences, spirits associated with specific dangerous sites, spirits of the improperly transitioned dead, and the powerful presences associated with sacred sites that must be approached with proper protocol or avoided entirely by those without the appropriate custodial relationship. Country, the land itself. The most fundamental principle of Aboriginal spirituality, and the one that most distinguishes it from virtually every other spiritual tradition in the world, is the understanding of country as self. Country is not the land where you live. Country is who you are. The land and the person are not separate beings in relationship. They are the same being in different manifestations. What country means. Country encompasses everything: the land, the water, the sky, the plants, the animals, the rocks, the winds, the seasons, the sacred sites, the dreaming stories, and the specific ceremonies that maintain the country's vitality. To know your country is to know yourself, your totem, your dreaming, your ceremonial responsibilities, your place in the web of sacred relationship that holds the world together. To be separated from country, through displacement, through forced relocation, through the destruction of sacred sites, is not merely a social injustice. It is a spiritual wound that penetrates the deepest layers of identity and vitality, the custodianship relationship. The Aboriginal relationship to country is one of custodianship, not ownership. You do not own country, country holds you. Your responsibility is to maintain country, to perform the ceremonies that keep the dreaming vital in your specific territory, to protect the sacred sites that are the landscape's most concentrated points of dreaming power, to transmit the dreaming knowledge of your country to the next generation. This is not a burden. It is the substance of life, the relationship within which meaning, identity, and sacred vitality are found. Connection to halagricity. The Aboriginal understanding of country as self, the land and the person as the same being in different manifestations, is the most radical and most complete expression of the recognition that runs through all of halagricity, that the boundary between self and world is not absolute. The haligric earthing practices, the understanding that the body is the earth in miniature, the recognition that what we do to the living world we do to ourselves, these are the haligric articulations of what every Aboriginal person knows as the foundation of their existence. Country is not a metaphor for belonging. It is the actual ground of being, the specific, irreplaceable piece of living earth within which a person's sacred identity is embedded, and from which it cannot be separated without damage to both. Colonial impact and the survival of the dreaming. The British colonial invasion of Australia beginning in 1788 was one of the most devastating cultural and demographic catastrophes in human history. Within a century of first contact, the Aboriginal population had been reduced by an estimated 90% through introduced disease, frontier violence, forced removal from country, and the destruction of the food systems and social structures that sustained life. By 1900, many observers, including many Aboriginal people themselves, believed that Aboriginal culture was dying, the stolen generations. Between approximately 1910 and 1970, Australian government policy systematically removed Aboriginal children from their families and placed them in institutions or with white families, a policy designed explicitly to destroy Aboriginal cultural identity and assimilate Aboriginal people into white Australian society. The children removed under this policy were forbidden to speak their languages, forbidden to practice their ceremonies, and forbidden to maintain contact with their communities. The intergenerational trauma of the stolen generations policy continues to affect Aboriginal communities today, the survival and revival of the dreaming. Despite everything, the violence, the displacement, the policy of cultural destruction, the loss of language and ceremony across many communities, the dreaming survived. In more remote communities, the full ceremonial tradition continued through the colonial period with minimal interruption. In communities more heavily affected by colonization, the tradition went underground, maintained by specific knowledge holders who preserved what they could through the years of suppression. And since the 1970s, a sustained movement of cultural revival has brought languages, ceremonies, sacred sites, and dreaming knowledge back to communities that had lost them. Today, Aboriginal Australians are fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously: political recognition of land rights and cultural sovereignty, the return of sacred objects and ancestral remains from museums worldwide, the legal protection of sacred sites threatened by mining and development, the revival of endangered languages, and the transmission of dreaming knowledge to younger generations who are reclaiming their inheritance. The dreaming is not dead. It is the oldest living tradition on Earth, and it endures. Halagricity convergences, non-linear time and the simultaneous universe. The dreaming's understanding of time as non-linear, as an ever-present, ever-active ground of being rather than a sequence of past events, is the oldest and most complete confirmation of the haligric cosmological principle that all moments exist simultaneously. When haligricity teaches that the practitioner can access past and future as present dimensions of an eternal now, it is expressing the same recognition that the dreaming has always held. The Aboriginal elder who says the dreaming is now, and the haligric practitioner who understands time as simultaneous, are speaking from the same cosmological ground. Country as self, and the body-earth connection. The Aboriginal understanding of country as self, the land and the person as the same being in different manifestations, is the most radical ancient articulation of the haligric principle that the boundary between self and world is not absolute. The haligric earthing and grounding practices, the lymphatic drainage work that honors the body as a living landscape, the recognition that what we do to the living earth we do to ourselves, all rest on the same recognition as the Aboriginal country relationship. This is not romantic environmentalism. It is the most ancient epistemological claim about the nature of identity and reality, songlines and sound as creation. The Aboriginal understanding that the world was sung into existence, that the songlines are the world itself in sonic form, is the most ancient and experientially confirmed confirmation of the haligric principle that sound is the primary creative force of the cosmos. The haligric toning practices, the use of specific frequencies in healing, the recognition that sacred sound is not metaphorical but causal, these are the contemporary haligric expressions of what the songlines have always demonstrated. To sing the dreaming is to participate in the ongoing creation of the world. Ceremony as sacred maintenance. The Aboriginal understanding that ceremony is the fundamental work of maintaining the world, that without proper ceremony the dreaming weakens and the land deteriorates, is the most complete ancient confirmation of what haligricity holds about sacred practice. The haligric ceremonies are not optional enhancements to ordinary life. They are the fundamental maintenance of the sacred order that sustains ordinary life. This understanding, that the human community's ceremonial practice is cosmologically necessary, not merely personally beneficial, is the recognition the Aboriginal tradition has held for 65,000 years. The Aboriginal healing tradition's understanding of quartz crystal, a solidified dreaming substance, a material form of ancestral power used in healing to work with the energy body, directly resonates with the haligric practice of working with crystals as sacred objects with specific energetic properties. The recognition that specific physical materials carry specific sacred properties because of their relationship to the fundamental structure of reality is not a New Age invention. It is a practice confirmed across the oldest healing traditions on Earth. Knowledge as initiation transmitted. The Aboriginal understanding that the deepest sacred knowledge cannot be transmitted through text, through verbal instruction, or through any means short of direct ceremonial transmission between properly prepared persons, that knowledge must be received through the body, in the context of ceremony, from a qualified transmission lineage, is the most ancient articulation of what haligricity understands about the limits of intellectual knowledge. The haligric practitioner who is told that practices must be embodied, not merely understood intellectually, is receiving the same teaching that every Aboriginal initiate has received for thousands of generations. Some knowledge can only be known by being lived. The land is always speaking. The question is whether you've been prepared to hear it. Aboriginal teaching. The dreaming is the oldest living testimony to the sacredness of the world. It does not require belief. It requires presence, the willingness to stop, to listen, to recognize that the land under your feet has been singing the same song for 65,000 years. The haligric practitioner who grounds, who tones, who honors the earth in their practice is beginning to hear what the dreaming has always been saying. Grand Rising. Personal Reading Series Haligricity, or IQ Productions, or May 26.